Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Advantage Austria Lagos webinar. Today, our topic would be the startup scene in Nigeria. My name is Jennifer Aino, and I'll be your moderator for today. So today, we'll be talking a lot about the startup scene in Nigeria, the opportunities, challenges, and hopefully we'll be able to answer all the questions you might have on Nigeria. And speaking on questions, we would be answering questions at the end of the webinar. Please use the chat function on the side of your screen, and we'll try and answer as much questions as we can. So to go into our webinar straight away, I would like to introduce our commercial counselor, Mr. Guido Stock, who would be giving the opening remarks. So just a brief intro on Guido. Just shortly before coming to Nigeria in 2018, Guido was the regional manager for North and Latin America at Advantage Austria Vienna. And this is also not Guido's first time in Nigeria. He was also the commercial counselor from 1995 to 2003. So we can safely say that he's the son of the soil. He has also served under different capacities in Mexico City, London, and Jakarta. So over to you, Guido.
Thank you, Jenny. And 8 years in Australia as well.
Oh,
so
sorry.
Never Australia, Austria being mixed up. It's okay with me. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Jenny. And
thank you.
Good morning and welcome, everybody. Nice to have you all with us today. I looked at the list of participants and I saw many of you have most probably not been with us yet in the past, but I've also seen a few young, let's say, young semi-old hands, some amongst you who have already visited us. I will nevertheless say something, say most probably quite a lot about Nigeria. I think even those who have been with us already might find the one or other information which might be of interest to them. Maybe a few words first about our office for those who don't know us and maybe also don't know what we do, or at least don't know it exactly. So we are an office of the Austrian Federal Economic Chamber, the Austrian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. We are an office of the foreign trade, of the trade promotion arm of the Austrian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And we are promoting trade between 14 African countries and Austria. So we cover a number of countries from Sierra Leone and Liberia in the west down to the two Congos. But our biggest country, the biggest economy we look after is, of course, Nigeria. We promote trade between the countries we cover and Austria, but also investment. We always act in both directions. So we help Nigerian or African countries as much in starting business relations with Austrian, say, importers, as we do Austrian business people in exporting to the African countries. One of the fields we look after is innovation, and this has become more and more important because Nigeria is the innovation hub in Africa. But you will hear more about this from the experts. I will just talk a bit in general about Nigeria. Nigeria is the most populous country, the most populous nation in Africa. It's also the biggest country economy-wise. The Nigerian economy is the largest African economy. Nigeria is still to a large extent an agricultural country. Agriculture provides a lot of the employment needed to the population and, of course, provides food to the nation. Services are also a very important part of the economy, mainly trade within the country. Nigeria is an is very much known as an oil and gas economy. And in fact, about 95%, almost all the Nigerian exports consist of oil and gas. The population has been growing and is growing, will keep growing tremendously. When Nigeria became independent in 1960, the population count was about 45 million. When I came here first in 1979, not as a trade commissioner, but for an Austrian company, for a few months, the population size was 72 million. When I came here in 1995 as trade commissioner, as commercial councillor, the population was about 108 million. I could continue and continue. We are now at 215 million, and in 2050, the population is expected to be 400 million. So Nigeria is going to be the third most populous nation on earth, after India and China, ahead of the United States in 2050. Population growth is between 2.6 and 3.2%. Those are estimates. And sadly, economic growth has not been upkeeping with population growth for many years. Actually, last year was the first year for many years during which population economic growth was slightly higher than population growth. This year, hopefully, the same thing will be the case, but economic growth is not much higher than population growth. So there is, even last year, this year, progress will be, in social progress will be very limited, if there is any. Government finances are in disarray. Nigeria is not alone in this situation. This is the case in quite a number of African countries. But I would say it's sadly especially so in Nigeria. Nigeria is hardly able to service its debt from government income, and the Nigerian government has to increase debt, has to accept new loans all the time. So the public sector is in a very difficult situation, and my recommendation would be, if you are interested in the Nigerian market, try to focus on the vibrant private market. Nigerians are born entrepreneurs, and when you travel in Nigeria, you will see that any bookshop, and there are always bookshops at airports here, any bookshop full of management literature. Young Nigerians want to educate themselves. Everybody is interested in economic matters, and it is there's a vibrant private sector. And I believe that whenever there are improved circumstances for the private sector to operate, Nigeria has the potential to take off. The Nigerian economy has the potential to take off like a rocket. We will have elections here, general elections, end of February. There will be a new government in place, most probably in later spring or so, in May, maybe even June, is late of June. It will certainly be a completely new government. Whoever wins will win the elections. There are three main competitors. All of them, I believe, are much more business-minded than the president Nigeria has at the moment. Nigeria's president at the moment is an ex-general, and Nigeria has actually been governed by former generals during most of its history as an independent nation since 1996. So during the upcoming, or as a result of the upcoming elections, it's quite sure that there will be no former general becoming the president again. All three competitors for the job are very business-minded. There's Ahmed Bola Tinubu, who used to be the governor of Lagos, very business-minded. Then there is Atiku. Atiku, I think, has been trying to become president, I think, 8 times or so. Also very business-minded, has his own business empire. And then there is Peter Obi, highly educated in the economic field, former governor from the East. One of them will most probably become these are the main candidates, and one of them will most probably become the president. I believe that with a new president, although the situation in the field of public finances is not going to change overnight, there will be positive development in Nigeria starting next year. Nigerians are born optimists, and I think even though public finances will still be in a very difficult situation, whatever the circumstances, with the optimism of Nigerians, there will be a new start, latest by mid of next year. Maybe finally, I have already been quite long. Finally, just one thing: there are giant projects in Nigeria to engage in, and one of these projects is just being finalized. One of the world's biggest refineries is going to go into operation next year. It's a big private sector refinery owned by the Dangote Group. And that will be a game changer insofar as Nigeria will, the oil and gas producing country, Nigeria will for the first time in its history be able to cover its own needs when it comes to petroleum, motor spirit, diesel, oils, etc., and will also even be able to export these products. Yeah, that was a brief overview, and I hope you will find our webinar useful. Wish you some interesting 45 minutes with us now. Thank you.
Thank you, Guido. Before I jump on to our next speaker, I would just like to give you some statistics on the Nigerian startup ecosystem. So we have about 750 startups in Nigeria. That's a lot. And the top industry that we currently have is in e-commerce and retail, fintech, and education. But of course, we're also quite vast in other startup sectors as well. Lagos is also ranked as #1 startup city in Africa, based on the data from the Startup Links Global Startup Ecosystem Index. If anyone's interested in this publication, I'll be happy to share it with you. And also on the global ranking, Nigeria sits on the 122nd spot, rising 5 spots from 2020. Yeah, so I'm going to let my next speaker speak a bit more on the startup ecosystem in Nigeria, and that is Akintola Adesami. He will be giving us an insight into the startup ecosystem in Nigeria, like I said. Tola is a co-founder and CEO at Split, which is a financial service and prop tech startup which fractionalizes rent into monthly payments. Now, I don't think a lot of you might understand what we mean, but here in Nigeria, we tend to, landlords tend to ask us to pay a year advance or even 2 years advance your rent. So it's not like in Europe where you pay every month. So he's helping us, deal with that. Um, his passion for solving problems in Africa and for social impact led him to create Split. Tola is also an accomplished product manager and designer with over 11 years of experience working on products in fintech, real estate, and the banking industry. So we're very happy to have you here today, Tola, and we'll be ready when you are.
I'm ready. Thank you very much, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tola. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Split. I'd like to make this presentation more conversational than I would usually do. And my what I want to sort of do is sort of educate you on the history of the Nigerian startup scene and where I believe we're going to, right? As introduced, I'm the CEO at Split. Split is a financial services solution company that's making renting much easier in Africa. What does that mean? Started out in 2018 trying to solve a problem my co-founder had. He moved back from Europe, from the UK, and he couldn't pay his rent because landlords were requiring that he pay 2 years in advance, right? And it wasn't the system he was used to, so he was couch surfing for a while. So we got together in 2018 to solve this problem, and getting deep into this into the solution, we started to see that there were myriads of problems, right? So we have eventually evolved to a company that's building an ecosystem for landlords, tenants, facility managers, real estate agents to make the renting process much easier, enabling tenants pay their rent monthly, enabling landlords verify and collect their rent monthly as well, and just keep that ecosystem, running and much easier. Um, Moving to the Nigerian startup scene, I was privileged to work in one of the early fintech companies. Like every other ecosystem around the world, the US, India, the UK, fintech is one of the first players in the startup scene. And the reason for that is because money is important, right? And the movement of money or making the movement of money much seamless and much easier is a challenge that people try to solve. I've tried to solve um, time immemorial. Essentially, using technology to solve this problem was one of the first things the first two companies in Nigeria that started out decided to solve. These companies are InterSwitch and eTransact. And I was privileged to work at eTransact as a product manager, building solutions for banks. They started out in 2009, um, building a switch. A switch is essentially a system that enables payments move from one bank to another, right, automatically, with what we call a settlement process. A settlement process is an operational process where a bank can debit their standard ledger and credit another bank's standard ledger with an account that that bank has with them. So InterSwitch and eTransact were one of the were the two first companies to become switches or switching companies in Nigeria. Um, and with that innovation, they decided to build a lot of things on top of that. So I remember that at my time at eTransact, we were building mobile apps for banks, right? So we had the underlying switch, but we were building solutions that would validate the switch. So in our case, we had partnered with some banks to build mobile apps that enable their customers move money, pay bills across this switch. And then Unified Payments and Remitter came about. Remitter was set up to solve payroll issues with government institutions. Payments to help government institutions sort of settle huge transactions across board. These are the people I would like to call the fintech 1.0 players, right? They gave birth to the tech ecosystem that we all know today. At the time, and if we all know a bit about tech today is largely funded by venture capital funds. Venture capital is an asset class, the most risky asset class that funds fast growing businesses, technology or technology enabled fast growing businesses. But at the time, we didn't have venture capital money coming into Nigeria. So I know it's on record that InterSwitch was actually funded by private equity, right? Private equity today would largely fund later stage companies, right, and take a huge amount of equity funding those companies. But in their time, they didn't have access to venture capital. There were no local companies, funding technology, but we had private equity, and these private equity companies decided to take a risk on these companies on this thing that was new and innovative, to see how they could scale it. But at the time, compared to what we have today, those private equity companies were taking too much equity in these companies, right? So I'm sure that if you look at the history of funding for these companies, there's had to be a lot of secondary sales of shares to keep these companies afloat. But yes, these were the first players in our tech ecosystem, and like every other ecosystem in the world, like as I mentioned, fintech came first. In 2015, 2016, we had the fintech 2.0 companies. Um, by 2014, we started seeing local companies start to disburse what I would call venture capital, but more like crowd-funded venture capital, right? So angel investors had already seen what was happening in Silicon Valley. They were exposed to the growth of technology companies in Silicon Valley because of the advent of the internet becoming more common in Nigeria. And they were looking for companies locally that were building things that were as innovative as companies abroad. So by 2016, we had the first two companies that would go to the popular um, accelerator program in Silicon Valley. Paystack was the first company. So Paystack is a payments company that facilitates payments on the internet. Their big goal is to ensure that businesses can transact on the internet, right? And it was really as simple as that. Same as Flutterwave. These two companies started a different revolution of or different type of movement of startups in Nigeria. And as usual, it started with fintech, right? Because they had to solve the underlying problem of ensuring that people could get paid and people could receive payments. Um, Today, Paystack has been acquired by Stripe. Stripe is a multi-billion-dollar company based out of Silicon Valley. And because of the alignment in their goals, Stripe acquired Paystack as an African expansion. This happened in 2020, 4 years after their launch, right? And that's how fast the ecosystem has grown. Flutterwave itself has become a $3 billion company, so they're a unicorn plus more. But because those companies were able to start, other companies came about. In more developed ecosystems, we find that when fintech starts to reach its adolescent ages and it's more mainstream, other startups start to come in other different verticals. By verticals, I mean other industries. So by 2017, we started to see the advent of health tech. So there were companies that were coming about trying to solve problems around health and hospitals and medicine and things like that. Um, we also saw companies doing e-commerce. Now they had Paystack and Flutterwave who had created systems where they could collect money. So people could sell things online, right? So we started to see the advent of e-commerce companies, which make up the large amount of transactions, on the continent today. Um, but a very overlooked thing that people don't notice, especially globally and locally, is that the next thing that comes after those two is actually prop tech, and this diversification into prop tech is very, very important for every ecosystem because if we look at the traditional banking um, of old, right? When you have commercial banking or investment banking, something that complements that is mortgage banking, right? And the ownership or the access to homes or innovating around that is always very important for any startup scene. So if you look at the US, when we saw PayPal and all those companies come, you know, reach their, maturity, you started to see the Airbnbs um, and other companies doing things like mobility come to play. So Uber, Lyft, um, playing in the prop tech space and the mobility space. Those are two things that come up once there starts to be, there's a diversification of a startup scene, right? And in Nigeria, it's been no different. We've had mobility companies, start to grow. So mobility companies doing things like delivery, um, doing things like um, movement or transportation of human beings and goods, right? Fast delivery, timed delivery, um, and even seeing that global companies coming into our markets to play and compete with these local companies. So companies like Uber and Bolt coming in to compete with GoCarda, Max.ng, and and the likes of them that who play and who have been grown locally. In 2022, in 2021, sorry, the African startup scene reached $4 billion in funding. Most of this funding, about 85% of this funding, came from VCs in the US. So the way Nigerian companies get set up is that they they set up their holding company in a foreign entity, usually Delaware or Mauritius, sometimes the UK, and then set up a local entity locally in Nigeria, right? To give these VCs or these investors some sort of confidence that they have legal covering, and that these investments are backed by law that they understand, which in turn helps our ecosystem grow, right? Like I mentioned earlier, these are the startup subsectors that we have in Nigeria. Um, we have 173, 36% of those startups are fintech companies, down to 7%, or down to 1.5% of the startups being prop tech companies, right? And this growth and this diversification is evidence of our growth as an ecosystem. Nigeria accounted for about 26% of the $4 billion raised in 2021. That was a milestone raise, which was about two times what was raised in the year prior. In 2022, already we have already hit that 4 billion mark. It is estimated that we will hit a $6 billion mark by the end of the year, which is a 50% growth from last year. So the ecosystem is still growing, still nascent. There's still a lot of problems to solve, which is why there's a lot of startups coming up. And because it's a huge market, like Guido mentioned earlier, we're 215 million in the country alone. Um, and Nigerians globally are about 300 million. So you start seeing Nigerian solutions being started in the UK, or companies in Nigeria expanding into the UK to solve remittance problems, right? Or companies in Nigeria sort of expanding across Africa just to diversify or expand those solutions into other markets, right? Um, we have about three unicorns today in Nigeria, InterSwitch, Flutterwave, being two of them. We have companies that have expanded out of Nigeria into Asia, into America. So, I mean, the ecosystem is growing. This year, despite the slowdown in growth of funding globally, Africa, the growth of funding in Africa has grown compared to every other ecosystem globally. I would like to talk about the rise of PropTech. PropTech is is essentially innovating around real estate, right? From construction and design to property and community management, which is where we play. We play in the property and community management and flexible living space, to investment and financing. So So startups solving ownership of homes, mortgaging, or financing of rent, things like that, and data analytics. There's there's a company there's a particular company in Nigeria that I'm really excited about called Estate Intel that provides real estate players globally, actually, with data on real estates on the continent, right? Every data that you need about all real estate activities on the continent, you can get from Estate Intel. There's a rise of prop tech. Today, we, for instance, we've raised a seed round of $2.6 million. Our total raised today is $3.5 million, and we're growing exponentially. We have competition that just raised $3 million, and companies behind us coming in the prop tech space raising their own pre-seed rounds. What these say to us is that there is there is a growth, or there is a starting of a movement of the prop tech space in Africa or in Nigeria, like the fintech that we saw 5 years ago, right? And it's a very, very interesting space to look at today. Um, as I said earlier, over $2 billion has been raised in funding from 2015 to 2022. Um, Most of it happening in the Series A and pre-seed rounds. So early growth stage rounds, and early stage rounds. Um, we don't have enough venture capital on the continent um, funding local companies. Most of these funds are coming from the US and Mauritius, or entities set up in Mauritius. Um, but as I mentioned earlier, $4 billion raised on the continent last year. We're on track to do $6 billion this year. And I think because we're still a very fresh, very nascent environment, there's so many things to solve. There's so much opportunity for people to fund companies or take risk on companies locally that are building amazing things. Incubators and accelerators. So, like I mentioned, Paystack went to one of the biggest accelerators in the world called Y Combinator in Silicon Valley. But we started to see incubators and accelerators being set up on the continent as well. So we see global accelerators coming to set up in Nigeria. So for instance, Techstars, which is a Canadian or North American accelerator, has set up a Nigerian office in partnership with ARM to fund fintech and proptech companies primarily. Um, Accelerators essentially help nurture and innovate, ideas while helping fund these companies at very, very early stage. And seeing that movement of incubators and accelerators into Nigeria and onto the continent also speaks to our growth, right? And also speaks to the market and the growth of the market. And the interest of the global ecosystem, or the global tech ecosystem in this market. We have a few challenges, like I mentioned, funding. Most of the funding today, it's more than 85% of the funding still comes from US VCs and UK VCs. Talent, because of the advent of remote work, local companies are having to compete with global companies for talent. So and the growth of the talent is much slower than the global ecosystem. So you find Nigerian companies hiring people from the UK, from the US, but it's something that the incubators and universities are solving. Regulation, I think from a structure perspective, companies are getting it right with setting up Delaware entities, or setting up Mauritius entities or UK entities, and then having a local entity. But navigating regulation is still one of the work that founders and their team have to do. Um, from my experience, it's much easier than in Nigeria. It's much easier than other countries on the continent, but it's still not a very straightforward process. Um, I would say that relationship and just being intelligent is a way founders try to navigate regulatory issues on the continent. Data, because with Nigeria, storing and access to data is still very, very poor. Um, Startups are not able to access data to make informed decisions. So we're literally jumping into the deep blue sea, right? To find ways to innovate around data that we don't have, right? And you find that since the advent of startups trying to get their customers to do transactions or to just understand their market and industry, a bit of data has started to come from um, the media tech startups and all the data that all these startups are aggregating. Infrastructure being our biggest problem. Um, Things like internet, good roads when it comes to mobility, um, proper structure for prop tech, proper structure of housing for prop tech. Um, those are things that companies on the continent have to navigate. The infrastructure deficit is still a huge, huge detriment to the growth of startups. And it's a challenge that startups have to navigate in Nigeria and on the continent as a whole. I think we're in the beginning stages of our ecosystem, of our startup ecosystem, and it's exciting, right? Split is my second startup. My first startup failed for different reasons because, but the major reason being that at the time I didn't understand venture capital. I had like it was my that was my learning process to understand how to raise venture capital and pitch and talk to investors. I was just a product guy that liked to build stuff. Um, but now there's a lot of information and there's more information right now, open source information to young people. And Nigeria being youngest population on earth means that we have there's a lot of exciting things that are to come, especially in our tech ecosystem. We're seeing people build on the side in their in their full-time jobs. We're seeing people drop out of school to build companies. We're seeing things that mirror the successes of Silicon Valley and the American tech ecosystem happen on the continent, and especially in Nigeria today. So we're particularly excited about the future. We're following that same, even though there's slight differences because of infrastructure deficits and all the problems that we have. We're following that same growth and success stories that Silicon Valley has had in the past couple of years or decades. And I believe that the possibilities are endless. The amount of capital that's being poured into Nigeria and this ecosystem is evidence of that, um, of those endless possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tola. That was very insightful. I can already see our chat box popping up, so
Wow.
get ready for your questions later.
Okay.
So moving on, we'll be talking to Odin. Odin is the new managing director for Blue Code Africa. He has been working at Blue Code since 2017 and since 2019 for Blue Code Africa. Earlier this year, he and his team managed to establish partnerships with several major Nigerian banks. With these partner banks, Blue Code will be bringing a reliable payment alternative to card payments to the Nigerian point of sale, hopefully by the end of the year. Card payments in Nigeria are prone to transaction failures. That's true. And we're hoping that Blue Code will help us solve these problems. So I would be speaking to Odin today to find out his experience as an Austrian running a startup in Nigeria. I think it will be very interesting for our participants here today to find out experiences from an Austrian's point of view. So I'm very happy to have Odin with us today. Hi.
Hi, hello. Hi, Jennifer.
So once again, I'd just like to congratulate you again about your new position as the managing director for Blue Code Africa.
Thank you.
So firstly, before we get in, maybe if you can just give us a little bit background information on yourself and about your company.
Okay, background information about myself. So, my background comes from business informatics. So when I was back in the time, I was very eager to become an engineer, software developer. And I worked as an engineer for a while, and as a matter of fact, the first role I applied for Blue Code was as a software developer. But then I joined in IT operation, and that started basically my career at Blue Code. Blue Code is a very interesting company to work with. It's has a great management and an excellent team. And that was basically my choice back then over a very established, very fancy companies. But the Blue Code team really made the difference for me to join, and it turns out it was the right decision. I greatly appreciate the trust that has been placed in me by assigning me to the role of the managing director for Blue Code Africa. And we're really looking forward. I spent a lot of time in Nigeria. I like working. I always have been working in other countries, setting up new things, make things work there. So that's kind of in my genes. And right now we have a very strong focus in Nigeria.
Yes, that leads me to my next question. So you're managing director now of Blue Code Africa. Why did your company or you decide to set up base as in have the hub in Nigeria as opposed to another African country?
Okay, yeah, good question. So Nigeria is one of our entities. So there's a Blue Code in Europe, which is a completely different kind of project compared to Africa. In Africa, we are. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, okay, thank you. Sorry, that just the call came in. So, and in Nigeria, the regulator is actually promoting financial inclusion. And Blue Code is offering an alternative to digital transactions compared to the card rails, and provide a merchant payment on the Nigerian instant payment rails. So when you as a government or as a regulator want to run a cash replacement strategy and digitalize these transactions, you would want to have a product that is very similar to that. So similar to cash. So it should be instant, it should be anonymous, and it should have other features that we can provide in terms of security, of risk management. All these things combined, looking at the market in Nigeria, made it very, very interesting for us to just try it out there. And now I'm there since 3 years, so it was quite a long journey to get where we are now. Of course, the size of Nigeria is very compelling. So there's over 200 million people living there, and there are lots of needs to be met, which makes it a quite unique place to be for an innovative and mature company.
I'm just going to piggyback on your last sentence, saying that it makes a very unique place. So why is Nigeria unique? Just piggyback on that question.
All right, excellent. So the opportunity to meet the needs of the economy in Nigeria. People there are very receivable for change because a change and adoption, because there's a kind of a lack of the foundation to support all these changes. There are a lot of startups and there are a lot of good quality companies out there, but the foundation sometimes is quite fragile. So this gives a unique opportunity to, if you can help improve this infrastructure. And as Tola was saying, infrastructure is an issue. I experience this also on a daily basis. And I guess it's about estimated $2 trillion to upscale the Nigerian infrastructure. And for us, it is important, like what we are doing is we're contributing our part as Blue Code by providing a payment solution that can meet standards equally and be competitive with other big tech companies on the planet. So, and also it's a country of diversity, and people are accommodating and hardworking. I mean, the culture there, the culture of the people, and the interactions with the partners is just different and sometimes very personal, and that's something that is unique compared to having business meetings here in Europe with other banks. It's very straightforward, stiff, but yeah, it's just a different kind of experience in total and a different opportunity than Europe.
So I just wanted to ask, so you're now, well, I know you've been in Lagos for quite a number of years. So I wanted to find out, are you planning on expanding? Are you planning on hiring staff? If yes, how is that going to work out? I mean, payments, how are you going to go with the payment, the policies? Because I'm guessing Blue Code in Austria have very different policies than Blue Code Africa. So how are you going to integrate both companies together?
Yeah, so we have made an special entity for Nigeria, which is Blue Code Payments Nigeria, and we have Blue Code Africa being in Mauritius, very similar to what Tolu has explained. And so what we're doing is we already have started building a team in Nigeria. We're now a team of 10 people, and I think this is an important step to conduct business in general in Nigeria. It's like, don't try to be a standalone entity here. You really have to involve people. You need to have boots on the ground. You have to involve people from Nigeria who are familiar with the best practices, who are familiar with certain terms and conditions that you just have to deal with on a daily basis. So that said, we have a local company set up, which has its own management also and employees, accounting. So we are pretty much Nigerian now.
Okay, so I'll just ask again more challenges. So I know you talked about infrastructure being one of your challenges, but what else as an Austrian company that would want to set up in Nigeria? What other challenge should they expect to encounter when they come to Nigeria that they not necessarily would not have in Austria? If they were to set up a startup in Austria, what should they look out for when coming to Nigeria?
I mean, a lot of things are pointing back to that infrastructure challenge. Is it roads? Is it traveling in the country? Is it having a server up running 24 hours a day? Electricity, education sometimes can be a thing that you encounter a lot. In some parts, it's even security, which prevents you easy access to certain areas in Nigeria. So all those things you can cope with it. I mean, especially like if you go to Lagos, it's an excellent place to be. But the first thing you will experience is traffic probably, right?
Yeah.
And these sort of things, this is what you will see and what you will feel. But these are things that you will overcome with the time, which will become just a natural daily thing in your day. But what really was a setback for us was Corona time, and I was spending a lot of time in Nigeria, and then you had to switch to video calls, and it was not that much of a thing at that time. And then you have challenges like connection, power supply, camera, microphones not working. Yes, that may not be easy at first, but as soon as you learn to cope with it and be part of this circle of this, then it's definitely a thing that you can work out to deal with, and where you can account for it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, you've been here now for 3 years, so it can't be all bad in Nigeria. So there obviously are positives of setting up a startup here. So I know Blue Code is obviously a payment solution startup, so it's fintech related. So you deal mainly with the banking sector. How has that been?
So the banking sector is very dynamic and willing to adopt features. So which is great, because you come into sell a product that they may want in their palette of features, which is good. And they're not like a 100-year-old bank here in Europe, so they are more agile and more dynamic in that regard. But they are also highly regulated. So that means, which is a good thing, but for us as a company, it meant we have to go through due diligence. over and over again. So you always want to know where are you from, what are your local partners, what's your license, and all these things to work out. But in general, I would say I really like to work with the Nigerian banks. And for me, especially interesting, it was to work in Nigeria because there is instant payment, for example, like instant payment platforms like NIP or working with eTransact, which is quite exciting for us as a company because these are things we didn't have real touch points in other countries. So I think it is a very good place to be. If you have a good product, if you have a convincing reason why this should work, then you will have a good way into the banking sector in Nigeria.
So would you say the Nigerian banking system is more advanced than the Austrian banking system? Or would you say the Austrian banking, or it's different?
In some areas, yes, I would say so. Due to the fact of being very grown very fast and very recently into this dynamic and agile place that you have to imagine just the instant payment platforms is a thing that we tried to solve in Europe or address in Europe for a very long time already. And we're still not there. And in Nigeria, I can choose between a couple of instant payment switches. So that is definitely a pro in that matter. But as for the what you have to deal with it and what may be a challenge is for such a fast-growing sector, it is sometimes difficult to deal with technical depth. So you want to have features fast. You want to have, there's a lot very competitive. So people want to be the first, they want to be the fastest, cutting corners. And if you cut those corners, you create technical depth that you have to pay off later on, which you can then sometimes experience in failed transaction from one bank. The banking system is down. To cope with this technical depth, you sometimes have to refactor a whole existing IT infrastructure, which is not an easy task. So it has the upsides and the downsides, but in general, I think is it more advanced than in Austria? I wouldn't say necessarily, but I definitely say it's more interesting than the banking in Austria.
Okay. So just the last few questions. What would you say would be an attractive for Austrians? What would you say would be an attractive startup to come to Nigeria? So what area do you think is lacking in Nigeria that Austrians can penetrate in?
I believe in general, if you can contribute to this infrastructure problem. So if you have anything that has to do with power generation, ICT, oil and gas, or textile, and I also believe if you have a product that requires a lot of electricity for manufacturing, for production, I believe these could be products that are sometimes easier to import for Nigerian companies than rather trying to set up a whole production facility and having to deal with these energy issues. So anything that goes in that matter, big machinery, needs a lot of electricity or needs a lot of uptime. These are things that I can imagine could go really well in Nigeria and there's a high interest from Nigerian companies.
Okay, so saying that, what would be your advice? What would be one advice if any Austrian company was to speak to you? What would be one advice you would give them when setting up shop in Nigeria or coming?
I think this forum is a great place to be. I have connected a lot of people over these webinars and also these Wirtschaftsmissionen. I remember back when Corona started, I couldn't travel. I participated in one of your events and I just booked my whole slot full till the evening. And I have to say, I got a lot of actual businesses out of that. So that's one part, is really just to get as much information up front as you can. Probably have some kind of network already before entering in the market, or have what is really key is having boots on the ground. You
Yeah.
need people in Nigeria that support you, that you can trust, and that you can work with. There is a lot of great people, and it's really a good experience here working with people. And probably as a foreign company, it is good. Like the hiring process is great. People want to work with a foreign company. So yeah, use this forum. You use the Chamber of Commerce to get connections. I'm also available if you have any questions after that. And just invest time and effort in answering and try to find people that have knowledge in the industry that you're working in.
Thank you, Odin. So I'm gonna again piggyback on what you just said. So yes, like Odin said, we do quite a number of webinars and trade missions to Nigeria. So yes, I think that is a very good way of just coming here, experiencing Nigeria, experiencing Lagos, using that time to meet people, network, and see what works. And you might have an idea, but then when you come to Nigeria, you would kind of you would see, and then you'll be able to tailor make it. So I do think that's a very good way. And speaking on that, we do have a trade mission coming up next year, most likely in April. So we will send information on that in due course. But that would be also a good place to start from. So Odin, just before we round up with you, can you just lastly just sum up your experience so far in Nigeria?
Some of my experiences, I would say, first coming into the country is overwhelming. So that's not, as I said, I have worked everywhere from Japan or Australia to South America and the US, Russia. But coming to Lagos, to Nigeria, that was like first overwhelming. But if you walk the extra mile, it's very rewarding. So going there and meeting these people and building this network was great for me. It was really fun to be here. It's really fun to meet these new people and talk to them. So I would say, if I sum it up, it's maybe seems challenging at first, but if you stick to it, if you have a plan, if you have a concept, it's very rewarding. The outcome is just a great experience at all.
Thank you so much, Odin. That was very insightful. If anyone has questions or would like to speak to Odin, like he said, you can send us an email and we will give you, we'll be happy to share Odin's contact with you. So yeah, thank you so much, Odin.
Thank you.
So moving on to our last agenda is the Q&A. Because of time, I'm just going to go through about 3 or 4 questions, and then I'm happy to reply all the other questions via email individually to you. So I have one here, and I'm going to just start that off with Tola. Question is, so I printed them out. Where do you see the tech space in 5 years, and what type of companies do you think will be in front and center of the innovation, and yeah, in that time?
Two things. I see more venture capital companies being set up locally. Today we just have about 3 to 5 companies, VCs that can lead a Series A on the continent. Believe it or not, most Series A deals that are happening on the continent are coming from the US, right? But in the next 5 years, I think type of funding that will be coming in would be able to set up Series A and later stage type VCs, um, which would mean that more companies on the continent can get support, right? So we will see the advent of more companies starting up, and I also see that learning to start a company would be a very very big prerequisite in local universities. So like your local universities will have incubators, accelerators. They started to have that. Covenant University, for instance, already has like a hub for tech, and they produce some of the best founders and companies actually. So yeah, that's what I see us in 5 years.
And then, okay, and who do you think will be funding? I don't know if I got that. The line was a bit. Who do you think will be funding these companies?
Local VCs.
Local
I feel
VCs.
like
Okay.
we would have more local VCs doing pre-seed stage as well as Series A, up to Series A, Series B type deals, leading those deals.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tola. And then this other question, I'm going to ask Odin. How do you think that the technology business are thriving in Lagos post-COVID?
Well, it was I think it was an increase. It was definitely growing by a lot. What it showed is that you had to live digitally. You know, the whole lifestyle, it changed from many people. Offices have stayed empty, and you feel it everywhere. E-commerce picks up, digital payments pick up. You don't want to deal with cash anymore. I would say so. It is definitely interesting, and for us as a company, it was very interesting to see, to also see. Okay, it makes sense. You know, you don't have to touch terminals anymore. You don't have to pass on bills. So the growth was definitely we could feel it well within Blue Card Payments Nigeria.
Okay, thank you. And then I have a question actually. I think I'll ask Tola this. We've been reading about the signing of the startup bill. How do you feel about this? And what do you think is the future of startups in Nigeria after this startup bill? This is my personal question. I want.
Mhm. I think the government, what that has done for the startup ecosystem is acknowledgement, right? We've acknowledged that we're a real thing now, right? That this industry that these young people are playing in is real. It's contributing real dollars to the ecosystem. Again, $200 million worth of value was created from the Paystack deal. Nigerians or local Africans probably benefited about 7% of that. That was poor. These were companies that the government or government agencies could have funded, right? So this startup bill creates ease of business for startups, right? Legal framework that would help us work better and faster than traditional companies. So I think for me, it's the acknowledgement, right? Or for all of us in the ecosystem, the acknowledgement that they would put a framework together and approve a framework together that that will carry us and protect our own dealings with the way we work, right? So it also shows that they're seeing that we're the oil and gas of the future, right? Of Nigeria's future, and they want to start to be involved right now by putting policies in place that guide our processes.
Okay. Nice. And I'm just quickly, Tola, I'll just ask you the last question and then we're done because I think we've gone over our time. Apart from Lagos, what other city in Nigeria would you think is thriving in the startup scene?
Enugu.
Enugu, okay.
Yes.
Why is that? Why Enugu?
Surprisingly, I angel invest as well, and I just invested in a very interesting health tech company. Two companies I've invested in actually, health tech and ed tech. Started in Enugu, and I'm starting to see a lot of founders in that place trying to solve problems there. What you have in Enugu is a lot of local capital, right? Old money capital. So, if you know anything about the Igbos or, the Easterners, they are traders, they are rich, they have cash, right? There's cash flow. But there's infrastructure deficits, right? So people are trying to solve those infrastructure deficits for themselves in that local area. It's a surprising one to me because people would think maybe Port Harcourt or Abuja or Kaduna would be like the next, frontier of it. But like in quick succession, I've invested in two companies that started in, two probably unicorn type companies that started in Enugu. And I've heard of a few founders doing the Enugu thing, then moving to Lagos. So it's such an interesting thing that I've come across. Yeah.
Okay, I know what, but I'm going to just do two more questions. One for you, Tola, just before I let you go, and then I'll do one for Udin. For you, it is what is the man-day rate in the market for consulting services?
I don't know the mandate rate, but I I know that consulting services, regardless of how the market is now, it's a down market. Everybody knows that.
Hmm.
Always make money. Everybody needs consultants
Hmm.
for everything, fundraise,
Hmm.
research, all of that. So I don't know what the rate is,
Okay.
but I know that they're in, they're they're in need. Like there's a need for them. There's a market for
Yeah.
consultants here. Yeah.
And I mean, I think Mr. Reiner Veden, I can always check that and I will send you an email once we get that information for you. So last question, I will just give that to Odin. Question is Blue Code also suitable for transfers to Nigeria, like Western Union?
Um, I would argue to say we have the technology for that. So what Blue Code does in general, not just in Europe, is building a bridge to switch out transactions between different markets. Meaning, we are the EMPSA, European Mobile Payment Association, and it is we have built the technology and we're sharing sharing the working group for that technology to switch out these transactions between different mobile payments, like Twint from Switzerland going to Austria, or an Alipay, or a coming from Asia tourists come here to switch out these transactions. And then knowing that we have this technology, this hub already available, on the long run, we will be plugging in our Nigerian infrastructure into this hub. Of course, you need a lot of things to sort out first: foreign exchange regulations, and you have to be in line with CBN. But I'd say the technology is there, but it's still quite a walk to go to actually being able to pay merchants in Nigeria with European wallet.
Okay. Thank you so much, Odin, and thank you so much, Tola, for participating in today's webinar. Thank you to everyone online as well. Like I mentioned earlier, we'll be planning an innovation trade mission next year. Details will be sent out in due course. That's all for me, but I think Guido would like to say a few words before we close out. But again, from me, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jenny. Yes, I would just like to say a big thank you, especially to our speakers, to Tola and to Odin. And actually a big thank you to everybody who joined us at our webinar today. Jennifer mentioned already that it's mainly her, she will be organizing a physical event again, and that will most probably take place in April. So it would be wonderful to have you on board in April. Nothing better than seeing for yourself or being present yourself. And we hope to have you with us. Thank you.